name is Dr. Michael Ferguson. I am a neuroscientist, and I am very excited to share with you the fusion of neuroscience and spirituality studies. This is an area where I get so excited and I get so much joy. The learning objectives for today are first, to define and to differentiate spirituality from mysticism. Secondly, we're going to be talking about how spirit is the music of the brain. And don't run away thinking that we're diving headfirst into Cartesian dualism. Hang with me because this is all going to square up with physical contemporary sciences. Concept 3 is going to be a hypothesis of mysticism. Beginning with our first concept then, of defining and differentiating spirituality from mysticism. What is spirituality? That's the question of the hour as we begin here. And I'm curious what your definitions and notions of spirituality look like. I am going to suggest that spirituality can be defined as the pursuit of ultimate meaning and value, and it's often called the sacred. And in fact, this definition of spirituality as the search for the sacred comes from the Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology. This is a definition that scientists are using to try and understand in an evidence-based way what is spirituality. It's clearly something that has motivated human beings and human behavior for thousands and thousands of years, but we're only beginning to study it using contemporary scientific tools. Does spirituality matter? Well, let's think about this. There are some perennial struggles. There are personal struggles of making sense out of life, of finding purpose, and of establishing connection beyond yourself. There are also perennial global struggles of war, of poverty, and of ecological carelessness. Taking now our working definition of spirituality as the pursuit of ultimate meaning and value, or in other words, the search for the sacred, I'm going to lob a contemplation question your way. In what ways do these challenges have spiritual dimensions to them? These personal struggles, I want to say that we can consider through the lens of personal spiritual challenges. And these global struggles, we're going to consider through the lens of global spiritual challenges. We're going to toggle first to this question about what is mysticism. And mysticism has been defined particularly by Evelyn Underhill as the art of union with reality. First, let's consider what is the difference then in these framings between spirituality and mysticism. It's kind of like the difference between being sporty versus being athletic. You can have a fan who is very sporty, but that's different than an athlete who is in the game. And again, that gets close to the heart of this difference between being spiritual versus being inclined toward mysticism. And I want to point out also that as we're making this differentiation of sporty and athletic as a metaphor for spiritual versus mystic, this doesn't necessitate that you're a professional of any sort. You can have people who are athletic, but not necessarily going to be remembered as the greatest of all time. And that's the same for mysticism. You don't have to be a renowned historical mystic in order to engage in mysticism. So this list of personal struggles that we're going to consider as personal spiritual challenges can be addressed through what's been dubbed practical mysticism. And again, hearkening to Evelyn Underhill, she has a fantastic book, which I would recommend anybody examine. It's called Practical Mysticism. Evelyn Underhill is very passionate about this concept that mysticism is for everybody. And she's even subtitled her book, A Little Book for Normal People. With this idea that global struggles have a spiritual dimension to them, this is something that we can address through what I'll call existential mysticism. And it's the notion that to make real headway, if we have any hope for addressing to some substantive degree these global struggles, that it's going to require that we engage a spiritual and even an existentially mystical dimension of our faculties and capacities. Flipping to a scientific approach to spirituality, a concept that has been studied through the lenses of psychological sciences is self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is a personality trait that involves the expansion of personal boundaries, including potentially experiencing spiritual ideas, such as considering oneself an integral part of the universe. And if you want to read more about self-transcendence, the Wikipedia entry is actually a good place to begin, and it has references to articles that'll take you into scholarly literature on self-transcendence. One of the scientific tools that is used to study self-transcendence is known as a temperament and character inventory. The temperament and character inventory, or the TCI for short, breaks down self-transcendence into subcomponents, such as self-forgetfulness. For example, if you've ever been in a creative state or in a flow state, or you're creating a work of art, or even if you're accomplishing some kind of a task that you find rewarding and you get lost, you lose your sense of time. That's self-forgetfulness as opposed to self-consciousness. Transpersonal identification, where you relate to a group or to a collective that is bigger than yourself, or even that you relate to all of nature and identify yourself as an integral part of a natural or a living system. And then spiritual acceptance. And we're going to focus in a little bit on spiritual acceptance. It might be the least intuitive of these. Spiritual acceptance is defined as a stable worldview, which includes forces that cannot be rationally comprehended or objectively proven. It's got this intuitive sense to it, that it's really, really difficult to demonstrate or make empirical arguments only. But when you have a profound, abiding, and a stable sense that there is more to life, there is more to being than we have defined with the tools of rational materialism, that approaches into this trait of spiritual acceptance. Example questions for operationalizing spiritual acceptance. So if you're trying to score, put a number to quantify spiritual acceptance, people are asked whether they have felt that life was being directed by a spiritual force greater than any human being. Or in a reverse score, I think most things that are called miracles are just chance. And a third example of a question that quantifies spiritual acceptance is religious experiences have helped me understand the real purpose of my life. Some of the work that I'm doing right now is to localize in the brain a circuit that is reliably related to stable differences in this trait of spiritual acceptance. The upshot of it is that spiritual acceptance localizes to a circuit that is grounded in a brain region that's called the periaqueductal gray. And it's really exciting. It was frankly surprising that this is a center of the brain that is very, very deep. It's not in the new portions that were more late to the evolutionary biological game, like the cortex of the brain. There are regions of the cortex that are connected to this hub, the periaqueductal gray, but that core itself is a very, very, very ancient part of the brain. And notably, the periaqueductal gray has been scientifically demonstrated to relate to other processes, other traits like compassion, maternal instincts and behaviors, unconditional love. And there's this beautiful convergence, particularly if you then look at the spirituality studies literature across traditions, wherein one of the related traits to faith is this trait of love. And in many spiritual systems, the purpose even of spirituality is to lead and to elevate an individual's disposition toward increasing states of love, compassion, acceptance. And so it's a really, really exciting and I would say illuminating convergence here. I want you to hold on to the thought about a brain circuit for spirituality, that may be different than what you've typically thought about before with regard to things like spirituality or faith. A lot of times people tend to separate spirituality from the brain and from biological systems, or they might even get a little bit scared and think that if you're now saying that biology or physiology or the brain have anything to do with spirituality, that you're trying to say that it's just an illusion. And that's not where we're going with this at all. This session, we got to create a framework of ideas and of concepts. So we have some vocabulary and some mutual understanding, but we are going to dive into practices, into ways that we can actually engage behaviorally some of these spiritual and mystical traditions. That's concept one, spirituality versus mysticism. Concept two, spirit is the music of the brain. This may be the most challenging of these three concepts from this session, and so it's okay if it doesn't click the first time through. Spirit is the music of the brain. Well, let's begin by thinking about music itself. And what is music? No, really, what is music? How would you define it? And how would you identify it? I want to sip my coffee here as I give you all a chance to populate some of your definitions for music or some of your explanations for how you would even identify what is musical. It's a deceptively simple question. I mean, ultimately, music is vibrating air. You could be a little bit more precise and say, okay, music is highly structured gaseous vibration. And this is an accurate definition, but it's also unsatisfying. And again, this is one of the challenges of approaching things like spirituality through scientific lenses, is that we can be really precise and we can be really accurate about the physical functions, and yet it feels like something is missing from the definition. My main point overall in this sequence is to define and understand music. We don't have to involve something that exists outside of physical reality. We don't have to add an extra ingredient. But we do have to realize and respect the richness of the ingredients that are already present. A term of art here for this metaphysical maneuver is non-reductive materialism. One of the reasons, and you'll hear this come up multiple times as you're tuning into my content, but I refer a lot to Aristotle and to the Aristotelian canon of texts. And one of the reasons is because thousands of years ago, Aristotle was hip on this concept, and it's dubbed hylomorphism. Hyle meaning matter, morphism being form. And so it's this exquisite and this intricate integration of form with matter that creates this non-reductive, this expansive understanding of life that doesn't require us to leave the physical realm in order to gain an appreciation for some of the things that make us feel like life is most worth living. So again, we're not trafficking in so-called substance dualism here, but we also want to be non-reductive. Or in other words, we don't want to chase away and try to stomp out things like wisdom, beauty, and goodness and classify them as mere meaningless illusions. When we start to do that, we start getting into a mess of troubles that none of us want. Let's build a metaphor together here. In this metaphor, a neuron, or in other words, a single cell in the brain, is an instrument. A network in the brain, or in other words, a functional configuration of neurons, is a section of instruments. And an ensemble of networks in the brain is the symphony. Now, it turns out that in the human brain, when the sections or the networks are internally synchronized, and the sections across this symphony or the ensemble of networks are also synchronized, this is what we call intelligence. And in a paper that I published in a journal called Network Neuroscience, we found that intelligence reflects synchrony both within networks and across networks in the brain's network architecture. So a question that's going to step beyond that, though, is what is your intelligence doing? What is it about? What's its organizing principle? And this is where I'm going to assert that spirit is to brain as music is to symphony. Let's breathe that in for a moment, because this is going to be a profound metaphor that defines a lot of the space that we travel together. Spirit is to brain as music is to symphony. Looking then through our definition of spirituality, where we say that spirituality is a pursuit of ultimate meaning and value, or in other words, the search for the sacred, this leads us to a personal contemplation. What is my music? And becoming aware of what my music is a first initial step in this path of becoming engaged with mysticism. Concept 3 then is to define a hypothesis of mysticism. Part 1 of the hypothesis that I want to put forward for mysticism is that there is a richly structured sacred reality that extends beyond our immediate senses. And a vital second part of this hypothesis is that actual union with this reality is possible. Some categories of mysticism include natural mysticism, ideal mysticism, and divine mysticism. And I want to quickly disabuse this notion that in order to engage in a mystic way or a mystic exploration, that one has to presuppose a particular belief system or even a particular quality of beliefs. There are atheist mystics, there are agnostic mystics, there are theist mystics, and this whole gamut of categories of mysticism is a very rich compilation of traditions that is so thrilling to explore. Some suggested starting points, and again, there's so many books. How do you even pick one to represent these categories? But just to give us a little bit of traction, an example of natural mysticism is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, who's been heralded as an American mystic in the Transcendental movement. Ideal mysticism, an example would be the Tao Te Ching, and an example of divine mysticism, which I mentioned in my introduction to neurospirituality, is The Interior Castle by Teresa of Avila. Taking from Saint Bonaventure, who is a mystic from the 13th century, he portrays the mystic journey as one of ascending levels of union with reality. And in his philosophical schema, there are these fundamental dimensions of power, intelligibility, and goodness that are just essential. They're intrinsic to the universe. And as one progresses in union with each of these dimensions of reality, one is fundamentally transformed. As we progress in our union with power, we gain personal strength. As we progress in our union with intelligibility, we become wise. And as we progress in our union with goodness, we become beautiful. A mystic vision then could be articulated as seeing the actuality and the potentiality of strength, wisdom, and beauty that are in self and in the world. Let's pause and breathe this in, because this is it's heady stuff, but it's profound and it's important stuff. That mystic vision we can think about as seeing the actuality and the potentiality of strength, wisdom, and beauty in ourselves and in the world. The mystic brain is an organ of awakening and becoming. A concept that I talk about in my introduction to neurospirituality video is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the fantastic ability of the brain to rewire and to reshape itself over time in response to experience. Neuroplasticity, particularly as we're talking about something like mysticism, is central for its roles in our growth, transformation, and embodiment of some of these virtues that we'll be discussing in the context of mysticism. And one of the practices that has a long-standing tradition across mysticism is meditation. Now, I will say that there may be a bit of a tendency when one hears the word meditation to either to go into one of two different reaction spaces. On the one hand, there are people who get spooked or startled. Another direction that people can go with the term meditation is one of boredom, where they think that this is passé. They think that they've heard it before. And if you remember the classic movie, The Christmas Story, there's that scene where Ralphie gets his decoder ring and he's listening to the Little Orphan Annie commercials. And he's so excited that he's going to decode this mystery. And he's sitting there and he's cracking into it. And the message is drink your Ovaltine, your health shake. People can sometimes respond the same way with the term meditation, where they're like, ugh, eat my broccoli, do my meditation. But there's so much more to it, especially once we start drilling down into some of the rich spiritual world traditions. There are so many varieties of meditation that are very exciting to explore. And I find a lot of animation from looking at these varieties of meditation through the lenses of neuroscience that adds depth and richness and vibrance to them for me. For example, from the Buddhist traditions, there are these practices, samatha, vipassana, metta, tonglen. From Carmelite spirituality, you've got practices of recollection, of quiet, of union, and each of them have a very specific intention and a very specific place where they draw our mind and where they draw our spirit as we engage with them. And in popular secular contemporary society, there are practices like mindfulness, compassion, and transcendental meditations that are gaining popularity and that have tremendous healing benefits. meditation is a healing set of practices. There's a therapeutic valence here. In my last video, my introduction to neurospirituality, I talk about how the spiritual journey is described in terms of inward movement. This is posted on my YouTube channel, NeuroMichael. In addition to the spiritual journey being described in terms of inward movement, it is also often described in terms of upward movement or in terms of ascent. And for that reason, mountain imagery becomes portrayed very commonly within mystical texts. And just for fun, can you name these mountains? These are two very specific, very famous, very important mountains. Mount Everest is, it's a geographical symbol in many ways for Tibetan spirituality. And Mount Carmel is a geographical symbol for Carmelite spirituality, which Carmelite spirituality, the pious tradition goes all the way back to the Hebrew prophet Elijah. And in the 16th century in Spain, there was this revitalization of Carmelite spirituality, particularly by the famous mystics Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. I'm going to be drawing deeply from both Tibetan spirituality and Carmelite spirituality, so we get a multicultural set of sources for some of these considerations and some of these mystical itineraries. And we're going to examine what each of them has to say about awakening and becoming. Summary and review here. We talked first about spirituality and mysticism, defining them, differentiating them from one another. Concept 2, we're really trying to dismantle this idea that in order to discuss spirit and spirituality in serious terms that can be compatible with physical sciences, that we have to invoke something outside of the natural or the physical system. We don't. And so I'm introducing this notion of spirit is the music of the brain. And then concept 3 is introducing a hypothesis of mysticism. If you didn't catch it all, that is okay. You can rewatch this webinar or watch more videos and keep on learning.
You'll be a mystic.